This happened to me during a business trip that I took last year for work. I arrived at the hotel and picked up my key to the room, which my company had paid for. It was a nice-looking hotel on the inside, though a bit smaller than most other hotels. There were maybe 30 to 40 rooms total and only 3 stories. My room was on the top floor, so I took the elevator up and started making my way down the hallway. I put my bags down by the door and reached into my pocket for the room key. But just as I did that, the neighboring room's door opens and a man steps into the hall. He greeted me, mentioning that he was my neighbor, and held his hand out, gesturing for a handshake. I confusingly shook it and told him my name, then started making my way into the room. As I walked in, I noticed that he went back into his room as well and shut the door. I thought it was strange that someone would come out of their temporary hotel room just to greet me as their temporary neighbor, but some people are just like that, I guess. I unpacked my small suitcase and duffel bag, then laid on the bed and turned on the TV. It was pretty late already and I was tired from the flight, so I planned on going to bed early that night. I took a quick shower, then turned off all the lights. I laid there trying to sleep for almost 20 minutes before hearing the neighbor's door creak open, followed by seeing their shadow walk by my door, but they stopped just before they passed my room. Through the sliver of light under the door, I could see their shadow get closer for a second before backing away and continuing down the hall. This obviously creeped me out, so I got up and made sure that all the locks were secured on the door, then went back to bed. The next day I went to meet my coworkers at a company-owned building where we attended a presentation and had dinner. I didn't get back to the hotel until 10 p.m. and I was really exhausted. I tossed my work bag on the bed and then got in the shower. I was in there for maybe 10 minutes when, through the water splashing, I heard the distinct beep sound of the electronic door lock unlocking. I knew it was too late for it to be the cleaning services, so my mind instantly jumped to the strange man staying in the room next to mine. But I didn't know how he could possibly have a key card that could unlock my door. Not knowing what to do, I stood there silently as I listened to the door slowly open and then closed, followed by footsteps walking past the bathroom door with the shower running. I knew that they had to know that I was in there, which terrified me even more. I tried to quietly step out of the shower as to not alarm them. Then I quietly put on a pair of pants that I had laying on the ground, making sure to lock it. I leaned my ear up against the bathroom door and listened. I could hear a faint noise sounding like someone was searching through one of my bags. Of course I wanted to confront them, but for all I knew, they could have a gun or a knife. In the moment, I really just felt helpless and frozen in fear. I had no idea what this guy could want from me, but soon the room went silent. While I didn't have my phone with me, I figured my best bet was to call for help. At the very least, it would hopefully get the guy to run away. I took a deep breath, then started banging on the bathroom door, yelling for help as loud as I could. I could hear the man's frantic footsteps run past the door and back into the hallway. I quickly got out and closed the front door, locking it shut, then ran to the nightstand to get my phone and dialed 911 with my shaky hands. Once they were on their way, I called the front desk to let them know as well. Of course, by the time they got here, the man was already gone, but thankfully the police found him in his car a few hours later. I'm not sure if he even got any jail time for his actions though, because they couldn't prove his motive to be harmful. I honestly think he was trying to kidnap me or something though, as I don't know any other reason why he would go into the room when he knew that I was in there. I worked as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas during my late 20s. It paid way better than pretty much any other job nearby that I was actually qualified for, but the most annoying part about it was the scheduling and the staff. At the time, the building was having trouble with the lack of staff to cover shifts, so my schedule would be mornings, evenings, or overnight, all randomly throughout the week. It made it really hard to even sleep sometimes, but again, I like the money. Anyways, I was working a late evening shift this night and was at the front desk talking to 2 of my coworkers. It was around 11 and my shift ended at 12, so we were just passing the time. In the middle of our conversation, the phone rang on the desk that I was leaning on checking the number. It was from one of the rooms in the hotel, so I picked it up and asked how I could help them. A man spoke, saying that there was something going on in one of the rooms down the hall and that he was really worried about it. I asked him what he meant and he frantically responded, telling me to come up quick because he was getting really nervous. I checked the room number on the phone, then told him I would send security up as soon as possible. Of course, though I was just referring to myself when I put the phone down. I quickly explained the strange nature of the call to my coworkers, then headed to the elevators and went to the mid-level floor where the caller's room was located. Walking down the hallway, there was a strange sense of absolute silence. I expected to hear whatever the caller was talking about, but there were no loud noises coming from anywhere on the floor. I also kind of expected the caller to have been standing by their door waiting for me or something, but the door was closed. I knocked on the door loudly announcing that it was hotel security. I didn't hear any movement or sounds coming from the room at all, and after a minute of no answer, I walked down to the end of the hallway, listening intently for anything unusual, then continued back to the door, knocking again. A few moments later, though, the room behind me opened their door. I said yes and asked if they knew anything about a strange noise or the caller from the room, to which they replied that they had heard loud noises traveling through the hallway a few minutes ago, but were unsure what it was. From their voice and facial expressions, they seemed really terrified. At this point, I was already starting to get really nervous, but things only got stranger. I grabbed my walkie and radioed down to the front desk, asking them to call the room again and let me know if they answered. After a little bit, they replied that nobody answered. I stood there for a moment trying to think of what to do before radioing back down to them. I told them to check who was staying in the room. After waiting for what felt like forever, they finally got back to me, saying that nobody had the room booked for tonight. Even more confused, I took out my security key card and opened the door. Since nobody was supposed to be there, the room looked clean and unused as far as I could tell. I searched every corner and found basically nothing. But then I walked over to the phone, I turned it over and got the serial number on it. Then I went back down to the lobby where my desk was, and I checked the security records for timestamps of calls that had been made from that room. Sure enough, there was a record of an active call having been made from this room to the front desk, the one that I had answered about 15 minutes ago. Obviously, the hotel didn't record the calls or anything, so all I was able to confirm was that someone was in that vacant room without permission. This ended up becoming a bigger investigation over the coming days, as the next morning one of the guests staying in a room on that same floor was reported missing by a family member that was staying in a separate room. The security footage of all the entrances and exits were reviewed, and the missing person was last seen leaving the hotel alone a couple hours prior to the call that I had received. It's still unclear if the two incidents were connected or not, but it's definitely a really strange situation. I don't know how the caller got access to that phone or who they were, but personally I believe that the reason they called seemed to add up with someone getting forcefully kidnapped. Based on their brief description, the person behind the mystery call was never identified, and as of right now, the missing person still has not been found. My family would take yearly vacations to a different hotel and resort every summer. It would always be me, my wife and my 2 little boys. For the most part, we would spend all of our time at the resort rather than going out and visiting other places. It made it cheaper since we didn't need to rent a car, and it was just relaxing to stay at a nice place and get away from everyday life. Of course, when we first arrived in the morning, we all unpacked and the kids immediately wanted to go to the water park. My wife and I sat on the chairs around the pool while the boys went off and played with the other kids at the water park that was right next to the pool. We sat there enjoying the sun for about 2 hours before we both decided we should get back to our room so we could get ready to go out for dinner. I got up and began walking around the water park looking for the boys, and after a few minutes I was able to find Sam, the older of the two, and asked him where Alan was. I changed both of their names for privacy reasons. Sam said that Alan was playing with another kid on the other side of the park. I told Sam we were leaving and to run back to Mom while I went to find Alan. I was searching, walking around like an idiot for probably 10 minutes, starting to get nervous. When I finally saw him, he was in the back corner where a few chairs were set up and was talking to a small boy that looked about his age. Sitting in the chairs next to him was a couple seeming to be the boy's parents. I walked up and briefly introduced myself, but they didn't respond. Aside from giving me a slight smile, there was an awkward couple of seconds of silence. Then I told Alan that we were leaving for dinner and led him back to the hotel. I asked him about who his new friend was, and he said he was playing with him at the water park, but that was pretty much it. Alan was a pretty talkative kid, so it was nothing out of the ordinary. But then he told me something strange. He said that the boy introduced him to his parents, who then invited him for dinner tonight. I found it really strange that someone would invite a young boy to dinner without even talking to the boy's parents. I told my wife as soon as we got up to the room, and she was also really worried about it. We ended up going somewhere quick for dinner and got back to the hotel around 5. The kids both seemed pretty exhausted, so we were ready to just relax for the rest of the night. We got in the elevator and made our way up to our floor. But as the elevator doors opened, Alan's new friend and his mother were standing there as if they were waiting for the elevator to go down. As soon as we got out, the mother looked at me with a short smile and asked if Alan could join them for dinner tonight. I briefly looked at my wife, who seemed just as confused and concerned as I was. Then I looked back at the lady. We already had dinner tonight, but maybe we can work something out for tomorrow. Her smile faded as she turned and walked down the opposite hallway, I assumed to their room. I knew both me and my wife thought the same thing, that they were creepily waiting for us by the elevator the whole time just to ask about dinner. When we got inside our room, we pulled Alan aside and strictly told him to not go near that family without one of us with him. He seemed a bit upset about it, but he agreed. I also pulled Sam aside separately and made sure he knew of the situation and that I wanted him to look after his little brother if ever we weren't around. We all took turns showering, then relaxed on the bed and couch for the rest of the night. I was pretty annoyed at how the vacation was going, already having to be stressed out for my child's safety, but I assured myself it would be better tomorrow. Eventually, we all got ready for bed and turned out the lights. There were 2 beds in the room, one that my wife and I slept on and the other for the 2 boys to share. A few hours into the night, I was shaken awake. I jolted up as I guess I was pretty on edge, and I saw Sam next to me, still shaking my arm. "You okay, bud?" Sam responded quietly, whispering to me that Alan was talking to someone at the door. I immediately jumped out of bed and turned the corner leading to the front door. From the short glimpse I got before yelling at him, I could tell he was in the process of figuring out how to unlock the door, and I could hear a faint voice on the other side. I sprinted towards him, screaming for him to back away from the door. Alan jumped back, frightened by the volume of my voice. I slammed against the door, hearing footsteps sprinting down the hall as I finished unlocking the door and swung it open. I know I should have just stayed in the room and called for help, but I was in such a rage that all I wanted was to confront the creep. Entering the hallway, I saw a quick figure of a man turn the corner down the hall towards the elevators. I tried to catch up, but once I turned the corner, there was no sight of him. He wouldn't have had time to take the elevator, so I knew he was staying in a room on that floor. After looking around for a few minutes, I ran back to our room and met my wife, who was already awake due to the chaos of the situation. I told her to lock the door as I was going to go to the front desk to inform them of the incident. By the time I got down to the lobby, my adrenaline was starting to fade out, and I was trying to calm myself down so I could explain what happened. There was a young woman at the counter that I talked to, and I could tell she had never dealt with a situation like this. She called a security guard over to talk to me, as well as her manager. After a few minutes of discussion, though, it was pretty clear that they couldn't do much about it. They had no security cameras in the hallways, only on the entrances and exits. I didn't have any proof nor description of the man at the door or his relation to the parents who asked about dinner. Obviously, I assumed it was felt like I knew for sure the intention of the creepy parents. I couldn't really prove it. In short, the best they could do was give a refund for the remaining days, so we had to move to a different resort 30 minutes away. It's a really terrible feeling as a parent to know that there was someone likely trying to kidnap your child, and yet there is nothing anyone can do about it. I hate knowing that those creepy parents are probably out somewhere right now trying to get unknowing children into some weird trap of theirs. Those people deserve to rot in prison, and I hope that me sharing this experience can inform other parents of the true dangers and hopefully help save their children from these horrible people. What freaks me out the most is the possibility of the boy that was with them being someone else's missing child who they now use to lure in other innocent children. As a property manager and real estate agent, I'm always on the lookout for abandoned properties that can either be fixed up or rented out. Or if I'm lucky, I'll find one that doesn't need much work and I can practically just resell it. And for a while, when I first started out in the business, I took a lot of information that wasn't actually substantiated by proof, which resulted in me buying some properties that proved to be pretty costly. So what I started doing before purchasing a property, instead of going and inspecting it by myself, I would always hire a professional building inspector to come with me so that I can learn all that I needed to know about the place. That being said, before I learned that lesson, I used to go in on my own to check out the potential properties. And one that I will never forget was an old abandoned asylum. I had originally planned to purchase it for the land and demo the entire structure before building off of it. But beforehand I wanted to get a better look at the property in person. So I showed up to this rundown brick building that was covered practically from top to bottom with graffiti. Even the parking lot was all tagged up. Surprisingly enough, though, the front door had a security keypad on it that was still active, and because the current owner wasn't in town, they gave me the code and permission to walk around the property. I let myself inside, and as soon as I opened the door, I could smell a strong rotting stench. And right away I knew that a sewage pipe must have burst or something. But that's nothing compared to what I was actually smelling. I slowly made my way into the abandoned asylum, breathing as little as I possibly could as to not take in that horrendous smell. And as I walked right away, I realized that the keypad I used to get inside must have either been new or just didn't work too well, because much like the outer walls of the building, the halls were covered in graffiti. As I made my way further into the asylum, I decided to pull out my phone and use the flashlight because the lack of sunlight that was able to reach into the halls from the few rooms that had their doors open. I continued to try to ignore the smell, but as I made my way further into the building, it only got stronger. I figured that in no time I was going to be coming up on something really disgusting, but I never would have guessed that I would end up running out of there as if my life depended on it. I walked around the corner of one of the hallways and stopped dead in my tracks, as I saw in big dark reddish-brown letters on the side of the wall in front of me, that there was one word written "Run." I got closer to the painting and noticed that seemed to have a bit of a different texture or drawing pattern than a lot of the other paint that was used on the other graffiti. But I just shrugged to myself and wrote it off as some kids being little anarchists. Little did I know that I might have been in imminent danger the longer that I stayed in that asylum. Continuing down the hall, I kept looking at all of the art, and before long I came across another message written in that same reddish-brown substance. Only this time it said, "He's close." I'll admit, by that point I was feeling pretty nervous, but I still decided to continue on. Boy, do I wish I hadn't. You see, as I continued to walk around the asylum and check out the rooms, I could tell that I was getting close to that rancid smell. And to my surprise, it seemed like it was coming from an old patient's room that had its door wide open. I couldn't help myself. I had to see what was making that stench. I peeked my head into the room, and what I saw almost made me vomit. On the spot laying in the corner of the room was a partially decomposed body that had been left to rot. I stepped away from the room and tried to gather my thoughts before I had a full-blown panic attack. And that was when I heard it. To this day, I don't know exactly what the noise was, but to me it sounded like a door opening and closing from down the hallways in the direction that I'd been heading toward. When I found the body, as fast as I could, I turned around and began running full speed down the hallway that I came from and toward the exit. As I made my way out of the front door, I immediately called the police. They told me to wait in my car until they arrived, and I told them that I would wait for them outside the gate to the parking lot. After they arrived, the police went in and confirmed that there was a body in the room. And after they recovered it, they told me that they would reach out with any information. According to their reports, the body belonged to a patient that must have hid there when it was abandoned over 7 years before. To this day though, I still don't know what that opening door sound was. But something tells me that there was more to that story than what I was told by the officers. I was never one for camping outdoors. I always had more fun when I was sneaking into abandoned buildings with my friends and exploring all the nooks and crannies that we normally wouldn't be allowed in when it was opened up. And when I was younger, I wasn't afraid of anything. I mean, I would exploring anywhere as long as I knew I wasn't facing jail time for breaking and entering. That all changed though, as I got older. And though I can blame part of my newfound fear of certain abandoned buildings on my age and my getting wiser, the real source of my fear can be traced back to the summer of '98. I was 16 years old, and a group of friends decided that we wanted to spend the night in an old abandoned asylum that we had checked out a few times. We had only ever gone there during the daytime, and we were excited to see how eerie it would be at night. The four of us decided to get to the asylum by 4 in the afternoon so that we could cut through the property and sneak in through the unlocked door behind the kitchen and get everything set up before it was too dark. And it's a good thing that we planned ahead because the door we typically used was jammed shut. For some reason, we couldn't get it to budge. Honestly, at that point, we almost called it quits for 2 reasons. The first being that I wasn't willing to break a window to get in. And the other was that 2 of the people we were with, Allie and Dwayne, got freaked out because they thought someone must have been there if it was locked. Kellen was able to calm them down though, and it just so happened that I found a window that was opened up a bit and we managed to open it up enough to climb through. Once we were inside, we headed into the auditorium, which was where we planned to set up our sleeping bags and leave our bags while we explored. And after setting up, we were off. Sadly, it wasn't long after we started walking around that things started to take a bit of a creepy turn. It wasn't apparent at first, but eventually we realized that we were not alone in that asylum. It started after we made our way through the 2nd floor of the asylum, which was 3 stories tall. We were only able to go into and check out 2 of the rooms on that floor because the rest had doors that couldn't be opened for some reason. So we moved on to the 3rd floor pretty quickly, but as soon as we stepped out of the staircase and into the hallway, we all heard a slamming sound come from below us. We froze, and I remember slowly turning around to look at the door that we had just come out of. My heart was pounding as I listened closely to see if there was another sound similar to the one that we just heard. There wasn't anything though, but the single slam was enough to shake Kellen up, who was now practically begging to go back to the auditorium. We all agreed without any argument, but in order to make it to the auditorium, we had to cross the 2nd floor again. Since the staircase that we were in had a door that was jammed closed on the 1st floor, the plan was originally to sprint through the hall and down the stairs. But that all changed when we stepped into the 2nd floor hallway and saw that all of the doors had now been opened. We all looked at each other with confused looks on our faces, and before we could even think about what we were going to do, another sound cut through the silence like a knife through butter and sent us all into a panic. Coming out of one of the rooms farther down from us on the right of the hall, we heard something that sounded like feet shuffling across the floor. I took in a deep breath as I tried to muster the courage to speak and ask my friends what we should do, but any chance of me talking was interrupted by the sound of a man muttering to himself from the same room that we heard the shuffling in unison. Without saying a word, the 4 of us sprinted back into the staircase we had just emerged from and began running downstairs toward the door that was jammed shut. Now, I'm not sure if whoever was in that room knew we were in the asylum with them or not before we ran, but there was no doubt that he did. Afterward, as we made it to the bottom of the stairs, we were all terrified by the sound of a deep, incoherent scream that came from the same floor we had just run from. Dwayne and I both began to throw ourselves at the door that would lead us to the 1st floor of the asylum, but at first it wouldn't budge. It was like it had been rusted or corroded shut. That was when we heard the sound of whoever was screaming making their way into the staircase. We could hear the sound of footsteps coming from right above us. We all screamed and panicked, but thankfully at that moment, the door finally budged. Once it was open enough for us to squeeze through, we all made it out of the staircase as fast as we could. There wasn't even a discussion about it. We all decided to just leave our sleeping bags and the few snacks that we had brought and just decided to run out of there as fast as we could. None of us bothered to look back to see if we were being followed, but after that day, I don't think any of the four of us have even considered going back into an asylum ever again. Staying in an abandoned asylum overnight might seem like a weird thing to do in your pastime, but the mixture of fear, adrenaline, and the memories that you will make is what makes it all worth it. Well, for the most part. Sometimes the memories that you end up making are ones that you wish would just leave your mind altogether. For instance, I'll never be able to actually sleep during my overnight urban outings ever again because of something that happened back when my brother and I were only 14 years old. The two of us and one of our friends wanted to have a sleepover, but none of our parents wanted to have any company over that weekend. So we decided to spend the night at the asylum that had been abandoned more than 20 years ago. Kids had been staying there for years and we knew that it wasn't super dangerous, but it was still creepy enough to make it fun. And that's even after we had gone there literally countless times before that. However, the fact that we had gone so many times before was the reason why we knew something was wrong that last time. We decided to stay the night. You see, we showed up in the middle of the day and hung out in the field out back for a while before making our way inside. And by that point it was clear that we were the only group of kids that were hanging out there that day, which was pretty normal. But as we were walking through the field toward the building where we were able to gain access to the asylum, we noticed something that we had never seen before. There was someone that none of us recognized standing in the side parking lot of the asylum. We tried not to pay him any minds, but we noticed as we got closer to the building, he started walking toward us. At first we thought it might be a new security guard or something, even though we had never seen one there before. So we decided that it might be smart to hide. As soon as we got inside of the asylum, we all took off and ran straight toward the old laundry room. We knew that we could squeeze ourselves behind the washing machines and hide for a bit until whoever was out there left. I'm glad we chose the spot too, because about 2 minutes after we had all hidden, we heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the hallway right past the laundry room. We don't know who they were, but for some reason they were looking for us. The three of us waited for what felt like forever, but was really only about 20 minutes before we finally decided that it was probably safe to come out. And thankfully, when we did, that man was nowhere to be found. For the next couple of hours, we were all very cautious and quiet while we hung out just in case they came back. However, by the time it was about 11 p.m., we had all but forgotten about the stranger and ended up actually falling asleep pretty easily. It wasn't until another hour or so later that I woke up with a really uneasy feeling in my stomach. Something was wrong, I just didn't know what. I slowly sat up on the floor that I had fallen asleep on and began to slowly look around. And I froze as I looked over to one of the windows in the room that we were staying in, and I saw the silhouette of a man standing and staring right inside at us. I couldn't contain myself as I let out a loud scream that not only woke up my brother and our friend, but also let the man know that I saw him. He took off running away from the window, but by then it was too late. We had all seen him and were quickly getting ready to run as fast as we could. It was as we made our way down the hallway that we heard the door on the other side of the hallway close. And as we turned to look back in the direction that the sound came from, we could clearly see the strange man walking toward us. We took off as fast as we could and started running toward the exit. We made it out of the building but weren't sure if we were still being followed or not, so we just kept running. The three of us probably made it about a mile down the road before we felt safe enough to slow down a bit and catch our breath. And when it seemed like no one was following us, we finally felt safe. That night we all ended up back at my house and we had to sneak our friend out in the morning. But as far as we were concerned, anything was better than sleeping in that asylum that night. It was the middle of the summer. I was 10 years old and my younger brother was 7. We were outside playing various games with other kids in our neighborhood, but we finally headed home and the sun went down. Now, maybe once a week, our parents would go out to a different restaurant around town, leaving my brother and I home alone. Most of the time they'd tell us before they went out, but if we were outside playing, sometimes they'd just leave us to our game. When we got back home and no one was there, so we assumed this was the case, confirming this was a note left on the kitchen counter. My brother and I both went to the living room to watch TV, something we usually did before bed. After half an hour, it had gotten completely dark outside. Just then I heard the doorbell ring, followed by knocking. At first I thought it was our parents getting back, but it definitely wasn't normal for them to use the front door, much less not have a key for it. The chances of the garage door opener they had not working and them forgetting a key were extremely low, although I realized it was still possible. So I left the living room and went up to the front door to see who it was. As I approached the door, I heard a man's voice, yellow, that he was selling Girl Scout cookies. I was extremely confused considering the time of day. I look through the people and see a grown man, completely alone, no cookies in hand, and not with his daughter as I was expecting. The man yelled out once more before moving his hand to the door handle. My heart dropped, realizing that we had forgot to lock the door when coming in for the night. The door handle slowly started turning, to which I quickly engaged the deadlock. A clicking sound echoed out. It was too loud. Clearly the man had heard it and now knew someone was inside. I waited a minute before once again looking through the people. The man was now looking through our living room window directly at my younger brother, who was completely unaware to what was going on. Once more as from where he now stood, I could make out a gun holstered on the left side of his waist. I ran back to the living room and closed the blinds. I told my brother we should get some ice cream downstairs in the basement. I needed to get him away from any windows, but I knew that if he knew what was going on, he would freak out. He agreed, and we went downstairs. I silently locked the basement door behind us. We ate our ice cream and eventually I could hear the garage door opening from upstairs, signifying that my parents were back home. Later, when my brother wasn't around, I told them what had happened. They were horrified and understandably called the police. Police inspected the place and one of the first things they noticed was how the front door's lock had clearly been tampered with, basically confirming the man had ill intent and was trying to break in what he had planned to do when he got inside, though I can't say for sure, and neither can police. The man was never identified. To this day, my younger brother doesn't even know this whole event took place. This happened shortly after I turned 15 years old. As a birthday gift, my parents had given me an Xbox. I was even given my own monitor, which allowed me to play it in my room. My room was upstairs, and in the weeks after my birthday, I of course spent a lot of time up there. It was a Saturday night. I was talking in an Xbox party chat with 2 of my school friends. Both of my parents were out of town at a work convention for the weekend, so I was home alone. I had my headphone volume pretty loud, but during a pause in our conversation, I heard a thumping sound come from downstairs. If you've ever been home alone as a kid, you'll know that any abnormal sound gets your mind. Imagining the worst, I turned down the volume and took one headphone off my ear. Nothing happened for the next 5 minutes, but shortly afterward, I heard the same noise again. I told my 2 friends about it this time, and they both encouraged me to go check it out, joking how someone might have broken in. I laughed and agreed to do it during the next break in our game. When that came, I took my headphones off and started walking towards the stairs. I began walking down them, and as I did, I began to hear soft whispering. I was only halfway down, but I completely froze up. I intently listened, trying to make out whether what I was hearing was actually real or not. Eventually, I crouched down to get a look into the living room. There I saw 4 fully grown men, all completely covered in black, silently walking around. I genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. All I knew is that I had to get back upstairs. I slowly started crawling back up them, and of course, one of the steps let out a loud creaking noise. It echoed throughout the house before returning to silence. There was no way they didn't hear it. Thinking quick, I ran to my room, put on my headset and told my friends to call the police to my house. They sounded confused and now in a serious tone as to what was going on. Just as the bathroom door fully opened, I managed to dive out of the window head first. I landed badly on my neck, but still managed to look back up at the bathroom window. A silhouette stood motionless looking back at me. That's when the backyard door slid open and 3 men came running out towards me. I tried getting up to run, but I couldn't. In time, all 3 of them started grabbing me and pulling me back towards the house, but this would be interrupted by the distant sound of police sirens. The 3 of them stopped. They looked up at each other. They then sprinted to the backyard fence, climbed it, and I never saw them again. A few moments later and the police showed up in the backyard. I told them which way the men had gone, to which a couple of them started off in that direction, while another stayed with me. The only man that was caught that night was the one inside the house. The other 3 that ran were never found. As police were asking me questions, my 2 friends who I was playing Xbox with pulled into the driveway on their bikes. Even to this day, I still routinely thank them for calling the cops, as it likely saved my life. Found left behind in the house were 4 different knives and a couple fully loaded pistols. As a kid, I lived dead in the middle of nowhere. My family owned a farm, and so we lived in a farmhouse, which literally had a dirt road leading up to it. I want to say I was 16 at the time. It was getting close to midnight. On this particular night, I was home alone. I was sitting on our couch in the living room watching a movie with Bear, our family dog, who we'd had for years. He was getting old in age and therefore wasn't the most active dog and could easily sit through a whole movie motionless by my side. It was during one of the quieter parts in the movie when Bear's ear suddenly shot up and his head turned around. I muted the TV. I myself didn't hear anything. Bear stayed completely focused in this one direction. It was towards the house's front door. My first instinct was somebody was at the door, but this just wouldn't make any sense. Considering the house's location, you have to go completely out of your way to get to our house. I don't think we've ever had someone come to our door that we weren't expecting. Like, this stuff just doesn't happen out here. I brushed it off as just an animal and turned the TV's volume back on. Shortly after I did this, Bear started quietly growling, still looking in the same direction. In the time I've known this dog, I'd heard him growl a total of maybe 2 other times. So by this point, I figured whatever was out there, I had to at least go check it out. I grabbed one of our family's many guns and went up to the front door. I opened it and saw nothing. So I walked out. I got maybe 30 yards from the front porch and looked down into the night. Nothing but black emptiness. So I turned back around. I took 1 step back towards the house before I stopped myself. Sitting on the edge of the deck was a man curled up in the fetal position. It looked like he was trying to hide himself. I stood there trying to think of what to do next. I was not about to walk up right next to this guy. So as silently as I could, I went around to the back door. It was unlocked. Because we always left our doors unlocked, that's not something we typically have to worry about way out here. Right as I got inside, I ran back to the front door shut and locked in. I then did the same with all windows and doors around the house. I called the police, and after a full 30 minutes, they finally arrived. They searched around the whole property, but didn't find anything. This was somewhat relieving. A part of me honestly started to think I had just imagined the sighting. After the police left, I ultimately decided to just go to bed. The next morning, I get up and go down to the kitchen to start making breakfast. But when I went to grab a knife to cut some fruit, I couldn't help but notice one of the knives was missing. I stood there, confused. I was sure it was there the night before. I got a bad feeling. I decided to call the police again. 2 officers showed up, and this time I had them search inside the house. I stood outside while they did so. After a few minutes, the 2 officers came back out with an old scrawny-looking man in handcuffs. The man was found under the basement stairs gripping a knife with both hands. It was the knife missing from my kitchen. After a short-lasting struggle, the man was detained. This was the same man that was hiding outside. After giving the whole story to police, they believed that most likely he had simply gotten in through the front door during the time it took me to go around the house and get in through the back door. From what I know, the man said nothing when questioned about what he was doing way out here or what he had planned. But the fact that he grabbed a knife couldn't mean anything good. I still think about what would have happened had the man searched any more of the house that night and possibly found me sleeping. I had just gotten home from work at 8. I picked up some food on the way home, so I just sat down at the table to eat while watching YouTube on my phone. While I was still taking my food out of the bag and setting it on the table, the doorbell rang. It was raining outside and I had literally gotten home 20 seconds ago, so I was not expecting someone to be at my door so suddenly. I went over to the front door and opened it. A man stood on my porch looking soaked and cold. "Hi. Can I help you?" I said. The man asked me if I'd let him take shelter in my house for the night because he didn't have anywhere else to stay. I felt bad for him, but I wasn't going to just let some random man stay in my house. I apologized and said no, then closed the door. I waited to make sure he left, but after a minute I hadn't heard any footsteps leaving. I looked out the peephole and saw the man still standing there. He was facing the driveway, looking out into the rain. I thought he was maybe taking shelter on my porch for a bit before going back out, which I guess I didn't mind so long as he left. Within the next few minutes, I went back to my food and sat down to eat. I had a lot of stuff from work on my mind, so that man on the porch wasn't a big concern of mine. When I finished eating, I put a show on and rested my eyes for a while. 30 or so minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I almost didn't even want to answer, but when I looked out the peephole, I saw a young boy looking to be maybe 13 or 14 years old. I opened the door and the boy was about to ask me something, but I interrupted him and asked what he was doing out here alone and where his parents were. He paused like he was thinking of a response, but then he just ignored my questions and said he was looking for shelter because he didn't have anywhere to stay. There was something wrong, and I knew at the moment those words came out of his mouth. With the boy being so young though, it was a really strange situation. I told him to stay on the porch for just a minute, then I closed the door and ran to get my phone. I had a feeling that if I told the boy I was calling the police, then he'd run away, so I didn't tell him. I called 911 and let them know that a boy was at my house claiming to be homeless. I made the call quick, then ran back to the door. I opened the door quickly, but standing on my porch were 3 grown men, including the one I'd seen earlier that night. I slammed the door shut immediately as one of the men rushed at me and pushed their body against the door. I locked it just before he turned the handle. I was screaming and crying as I backed away from the door. They were pounding on it and trying to force the handle to turn. After 30 seconds, though, it went quiet. I heard footsteps running away, and then it was over. Just the sound of rain hitting the roof. The police came and took a report from me with descriptions of the men and the boy that I saw. They had a similar incident earlier that week of likely the same group using the boy as bait to get the homeowner to let them inside. Then the whole group came in and violently robbed them. One of the men was caught a few days later while robbing a store. But as for the boy and the other 2 men, I don't think they were ever found. I work for a janitorial company that cleans office buildings in the city. We have set schedules for each building, and most of the time they request cleanings to be done outside of work hours. So most jobs I did were between 5 p.m. and 7 a.m. It varied depending on the building we were serviced that day. On this night, I was working with my coworker RJ, and we were set to do a basic cleaning in a 5-story office building. The floors in this place were really big, mostly filled with rows of cubicles. This was booked for our whole 8-hour shift, but it wasn't uncommon for it to take longer. We started working at 6. RJ went to the top floor to work his way down, and I started on the bottom floor to work my way up, planning to meet each other on the middle 3rd floor and finish up together. I started by rolling my trash bin over to each cubicle and taking out their trash, then the bathroom and main offices. Then I got my cleaning supplies from my cart and started cleaning the bathroom. While I was scrubbing the sinks, though, I heard the front door of the building open. I thought RJ had just forgotten something in the van, but a couple minutes went by and I didn't hear the door open again. Once I finished scrubbing the sinks, I went to the front door and looked outside. Seeing the van was off and the doors were closed and it looked empty, I figured I just didn't notice him coming back in. Or maybe I didn't notice him leaving and the door opening was him actually coming back inside. Whatever, I thought it wasn't a big deal. I went back to work. After an hour or so, I finished up on the 1st floor and moved to the 2nd. This floor was almost identical to the 1st, except it had a small reception desk in front of the stairs. I started with the trash again, and while doing this I heard another door open. I could tell it was from upstairs, but I didn't know which floor until I heard footsteps. They walked slowly across the floor above me toward the back of the building. I knew it was on the 3rd floor above me, but RJ could not have finished 2 floors in just over an hour. It just wasn't possible. I went to the stairs and onto the 3rd floor to see what he was doing. There was a main door and behind it was a long hallway filled with closed-in offices. I listened for a second to see if I could pinpoint where he was, but it was silent. RJ. RJ. I took a few more steps into the hallway, but I started getting creeped out. I backed out and went to the 4th floor. Right when I opened the door, I saw RJ standing in the middle of the room, cleaning with his headphones in. "Hey, were you on the 3rd floor just now?" He took his headphones out and said no, looking at me like he was confused. "Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm just starting on my 2nd floor, so I'll see you in a couple hours." He nodded and went back to work. I went back downstairs and splashed some water on my face. I didn't feel that tired, but I knew I had to be imagining these things. At least I thought so. I turned the sink off and patted my face down with a paper towel. And just before I left the bathroom, I heard a door open. It was from the main area on my floor. I waited in the bathroom as whoever was out there started walking around. I stayed for a minute, then opened the bathroom door just barely enough to look into the main room. In the far back was a man. He was facing away from me, walking slowly down the aisles of cubicles. It was so strange because he was just walking, not looking around or doing anything else. I watched this guy walk all the way down, then he further out and into the main room. "Hey, you okay, man? I don't think you're supposed to be in here," I said, trying to sound nice and not too provoking. The guy turned around and looked at me. He was far away, but I could see emptiness in his eyes, like he was looking straight through me. I waited only a couple of seconds for a response before I quickly walked out of the room. He still didn't move or say anything. I ran up to the 4th floor where RJ was. He was still cleaning and didn't seem to have noticed anything. I convinced him to come down to the van with me, where we called the police and I explained what happened. The police came a few minutes later and searched the building, but came out empty-handed. They reviewed the security footage of that night, though, and saw the man walk inside around the same time that I said I heard the door open. He stayed in the stairwell for a long time. Then he walked up to the 3rd floor and slowly walked around each room. Then he went to the 2nd floor, where you could see him walk down to the window. After my interaction with him, the man left the building as I went to get RJ. His intentions are unknown, but that empty look he gave me and the way he was just walking around were some of the creepiest things I have ever seen. And 4 months later, even with his face clearly shown or identify him. There was a period in my life where my parents were going through a rough patch. I lived alone in a small apartment and took my 6-year-old brother in while my parents figured out their situation. I was lucky enough to work from home, so watching my little brother wasn't too much of a burden, and it made me feel a lot better to have him there with me. my parents had a history of bad arguments, and I didn't want him to experience that harshness while growing up. This happened to me during the short 2-month time period. 2 weeks in my job scheduled an in-person meeting to be held during the second half of our workday on a Friday afternoon. This was a normal monthly meeting that we had to discuss our progress on our projects. With my brother being so young, he, of course, needed a babysitter to watch him while I was gone. I called a local babysitting service that I found online and got it scheduled. I didn't choose a specific person. I just let them give me whoever was available at that time frame. Come Friday, I got my little brother ready and made sure everything was set on the counter for the babysitter. At noon, the babysitter, who I'll call Chris, came to the door of the apartment building. I buzzed him in and showed him inside. He looked to be between 18 and 20 years old, and from the few minutes I met him before I left, he seemed to be very caring and nice, just like any babysitter should be. I thanked him for helping me out and left for the meeting. The meeting took a few hours, and by 5:30, I was heading back home. In person. Meetings always drained me because I was so used to working from home, so the drive back felt long and tiring. I parked by the front of the building and headed inside, then walked upstairs to my room. I unlocked the door, and immediately something felt wrong. The lights were all off, and it was really quiet. "Chris," I called out in the doorway. I stepped in and turned on the light. The worry hit me, and I got really scared. I ran down the hall into the living room. Right on the couch was my little brother. I gave him a big hug, then asked where Chris was. He said he left, but that was all I could get him to say. I called the babysitting company, but they said they hadn't heard anything from him either. They tried calling him and he didn't answer. They apologized and gave me a refund for the service, but that really didn't make me feel better. Nothing looked to have been stolen, though, and my brother was okay. So after an hour, I just dropped it. I made dinner for us and turned on a show for him to watch before bed. I started cleaning the dishes in the sink, which was facing the front door, when I had a sudden realization. I had to unlock the door when I got home. I never gave Chris keys to the house, and the only way to lock the bolt lock on the door was with the key or from inside the house. I dropped what I was doing and grabbed my little brother, then ran out of the apartment. We sat in my car while I called the police. I saw one of the blinds in my bedroom window move while I was on the phone. Then a minute later, Chris ran out of the front of the apartment building and got in his car, driving away. Police came, and later that night, Chris was found in his apartment. He made up a whole story, but it didn't make any sense and didn't fool anyone. It's likely that his plan was to do something to me later that night, then disappear. They found what they described as a travel kit in his car with provisions, survival tools, and blankets. His apartment was also cleaned out, so he'd been planning on doing something like this for a while. This was definitely the most disturbing close call I've ever had. I'm glad it was just that, though a close call, because it could have been so much more disturbing than it already was if I hadn't gotten out in time.